let this filthy, silver-haired, black cleaning woman in to embarrass me at my own gala.
Maestro Julian Whitcomb's voice cracked across the hall. His face twisted with pure contempt. He swept his arm down in one sudden, violent motion and hurled a page of his own sacred manuscript at the floor. And the paper slapped the marble and skidded to a stop right at her feet.
This is a platinum-level conservatory. We don't do charity for people like you who think they belong here. You don't! You never will!
The elderly black woman did not move. She stood straight-backed and unbothered, refusing to flinch under the assault. 200 faces turned toward her, and a live stream carrying it out to the world. Julian grinned, wide and vicious, and jabbed his conductor's baton at her like a blade.
Go back to your bucket trash. You people are only good with a broom.
He had no idea that this invisible woman had pushed a mop across these marble floors for 34 years. And he had no idea, none at all, that the legendary masterpiece he had just sworn no living hand could ever finish had been written, every single note of it, by her, before he ever scraped her name off the page. Her name was Ruth Delacroix, and tonight, for the first time in 34 years, she had already decided that she was not going to stay quiet. What did she see? In that moment, looking down at the page he threw at her feet. And how many years had she been waiting for someone to be foolish enough to ask? Rewind. 14 hours. It is 4 a.m. at the Barrington Conservatory of Music in Philadelphia. And the only person awake on the 4th floor is Ruth Delacroix. She is 61 years old. She has worked here for 34 years. Longer than most of the professors. Longer than the current dean. Longer than the crack in the east stairwell has run through the marble. She is standing in front of a small, square mirror, bolted to the inside of a supply closet door, pinning her hair back the way she has pinned it back every shift since she was 27. When the gray started coming in, and she decided she had better things to do than fight it. She does not look in the mirror long. She has not looked in a mirror long in decades. There is nothing in there she needs to see. Her coat is a size too big, because they order them in bulk and never in her size. And she stopped complaining about that in the 90s. Her shoes are soft-soled and quiet, because the one thing this building has ever asked of the people who clean it is that they be quiet. Her hands are dry and split at the knuckles from the ammonia she uses on the brass rails, and she rubs a little balm into them from a tin she keeps in her pocket. And she flexes her fingers once, twice, the way a woman flexes her fingers when her hands still remember something her life stopped letting them do, tucked under the bottom shelf of her cleaning cart. Behind the industrial rolls of paper towel is a canvas grocery bag, and inside that bag, wrapped in a plastic sheet against the damp, is a stack of manuscript paper 4 inches thick, hundreds of pages, music, all of it in her own hand, none of it known to a single living soul inside this building. And at the very bottom of that stack, in a folder gone soft as cloth from 34 years of handling, are the 11 pages that matter more than all the rest. She takes out her phone. She calls her son. Ma. Isaiah says, thick with sleep. It's 4 a.m. You teaching today. It's Saturday. Ma. Then you're taking Nina to her lesson. Don't let that man rush her. She rushes when she's nervous. And he lets her. And then she goes home thinking she's bad at it. Ruth zips her coat one-handed. She's not bad at it. She's got more music in her left hand than half the children in this whole marble mausoleum. Isaiah laughs. Low. Because he has learned that his mother says things like marble mausoleum about the greatest conservatory in America. And he has learned not to ask her why. She says it the way a person says the name of somebody who hurt them. You okay? Ma, you sound funny. I'm fine. Baby, eat something real. I'm checking. She stops. Tell Nina her grandmother loves her. Tell her yourself. You're going to see her later. Tell her now. Ruth says, in case of what? But she has already said I love you. And hung up. The way she has hung up on that boy his whole life. Because she raised him alone from the time he was 3. And she never once let him hear the thing underneath her voice. She does not tell him about tonight. She does not tell him that in 18 hours the Barrington Conservatory will host the 30th anniversary gala of Ascension. The concerto that put this school and Julian Whitcomb on the cover of every magazine in the country. She does not tell him it will be streamed live to the world. She does not tell him that she has cleaned the floor of Carrington Hall 4,000 times. And that tonight, for the first time in 34 years, she has already decided she is not going to clean it quietly. She rolls her cart into the corridor. 4th floor first. Always 4th floor first. The 4th floor is where the composition faculty keep their studios, and the composition faculty are the ones who throw things away. A rejected draft. A photocopy of a score with a professor's cruelty scrawled in the margins. A crumpled page a graduate student cried over at midnight and abandoned in the trash. Ruth empties the bins. What ends up in her cart ends up in her cart. She does not steal. She has never once in 34 years taken a thing that was not thrown away. 34 years ago. The thing she found in the trash was her own life. But we will get to that. She works her way down the hall. She dusts the frames of the portraits. Dead white men. All of them. Oil paint and stern collars. The founders. She polishes the glass over the display case in the rotunda. The one that holds the original manuscript of Ascension under museum lighting. The sacred relic. The crown jewel of the Barrington. She has polished that glass twice a week for 34 years. Tonight she stops longer than usual. She looks down through the glass at the yellowed first page. At the confident black title, inked across the top. Ascension. Concerto in D minor. Julian Whitcomb. And in the corner of that page, faint, almost sanded away by time and by a careful hand with a razor, there is a shadow, a ghost of ink beneath the ink, a word that was scraped off before another word was written over it. You would have to know it was there to see it. Ruth knows it is there. She wrote it. What does it do to a person? To buff the glass. Twice a week. For 34 years. Over the coffin lid of the thing they made. She finishes her rounds. At the end of the hall, she pauses at the door of the little practice room they never assign anymore. The one with the out-of-tune upright the students avoid. She lets herself in. She lifts the lid, and for exactly 4 minutes, in the dark, in a coat a size too big, at 4 in the morning, Ruth Delacroix plays. Softly, so softly the sound never leaves the room. 11 measures. The same 11 measures, the ones that end the piece the whole world believes cannot be ended. Then she closes the lid, wipes it down out of habit, and she goes back to work. You need to understand where Ruth Delacroix came from, because the men who built this conservatory made very sure the world would never have to. She came from a neighborhood called Paradise Row. It does not exist anymore. You can drive over it. There is an expressway interchange where it used to be, and beside the interchange, a parking structure that belongs, as it happens, to the very university the Barrington Conservatory is affiliated with. In 1971, when Ruth was 7 years old, the city and the institutions decided that Paradise Row, 9 blocks of black homes, black churches, black barber shops, and one legendary black music hall called the Emerald was blight, and they cleared it in the name of urban renewal, which the people who lived there called, correctly, Negro removal. They bulldozed the Emerald with the piano still inside it. Ruth's mother, Ruth Delacroix, played that piano. Odessa cleaned houses in the daytime, and 3 nights a week she played the Emerald. And she was, by every account of every old man Ruth could ever get to talk about it, extraordinary. The kind of player who could take a hymn and a blues and a thing she made up on the spot and braid them together so tight you could not find the seam. She never recorded a single note. Black women who cleaned houses did not. In 1968, get recorded. When the Emerald came down, Odessa's music went with it. Into the air. Into nothing. Unwritten. Ungrieved by anyone but her daughter. Ruth grew up in the rooms of a rented house, with the sound of that erased hall living in her mother's hands. And she decided, without ever quite deciding, that she was going to be the one to write it down. All of it. The Emerald. The row. Her mother. She was going to build a house of music that no one could ever bulldoze. She was a prodigy. Everyone said so. Cautiously. The way people say it about a black girl in 1979. Gifted. Considering. She won every competition they would let her enter. And several they tried not to. And in the fall of 1982, Ruth Delacroix became the first black woman ever admitted to the composition program at the Barrington Conservatory of Music. She was 18 years old. Her advisor was a rising young professor, 30 at the time, ferociously ambitious, celebrated as the great white hope of American concert music, a man who had published nothing of lasting weight, but who had a genius for being in the room where the decisions got made. His name was Julian Whitcomb. For 4 years he supervised her. For 4 years he called her, promising to her face, and limited behind her back. And he said the word folk like it was a diagnosis. And in her senior year, Ruth Delacroix wrote the thing she had been walking toward her entire life. A piano concerto. 3 movements and a coda. She called it Requiem for Paradise Row. It was for her mother. It was for the Emerald. The first movement was the neighborhood alive, the barbershops, the church, the children in the street, the Saturday nights. The second movement was the notice going up on the door. The third was the machines coming. And the coda, the 11 measures, was the silence after. Not empty silence. A silence with everything in it. The sound a place makes when it is gone but not forgotten. When someone is still alive who remembers your name. She played it for Whitcomb on a cold March afternoon in 1986. She watched his face the whole time she played. She saw the exact second his expression changed. And at 18, she thought it was pride. It was not pride. 6 weeks later, Ruth was called into the dean's office and informed that her scholarship, the only thing keeping her enrolled, had been reviewed and would not be renewed, that there were concerns about her progress, that perhaps composition was not the right path for her temperament. Whitcomb was not in the room, but Whitcomb's fingerprints were on every single word. She had no money. She had no family with money. Her mother was sick. She left the Barrington in April of 1986 without a degree, 21 years old, carrying a cardboard box, and the certain knowledge that something had been taken from her that she could not yet name. She named it 8 months later, in December of 1986. In the window of the record shop, on the cover of a magazine, was a photograph of Julian Whitcomb, 34 years old, arms folded, jaw set, beneath a headline announcing the debut of a staggering, generation-defining new concerto. It was called Ascension. She bought the record with money she did not have. She took it home. She put the needle down. It was hers. The first movement. The neighborhood was hers. Note for note, though he had stripped the joy out of it and called it restlessness. The second was hers. The third was hers. He had scrubbed away every trace of Paradise Row. There was no emerald in it now. No barber shop. No church. No black city going down under the machines. He had abstracted it into pure form, universalized it, elevated it, which is the word critics use when a white man takes a specific black grief and sands off the black, and sands off the grief, and sells you what is left as the human condition, and the coda, the 11 measures, the silence with everything in it, was gone because she had never given it to him. She had played it for him that day in March. From memory, she had never surrendered the pages. When Whitcomb copied out the concerto to steal it, he had the 3 movements he had seen on her stand. He did not have the ending. He never had the ending, so he did the only thing he could do. He ended the concerto 3 measures early. 1. An open, unresolved chord, hanging in the air, going nowhere, and when the critics asked him what it meant, he looked mysterious. And he said, "Some questions are not meant to be answered. The silence is the answer." They gave him a prize for it. They have been giving him prizes for it for 30 years. Ruth Delacroix went home, to the rented rooms near where Paradise Row used to be. And she nursed her mother until Odessa died. And she raised the son she'd had at 23 alone. And when the boy was old enough for school, she took the only steady job with health insurance that a black woman with no degree and a washed-out reputation in that small, vicious world could get. She took a job cleaning the Barrington Conservatory of Music. She has cleaned it for 34 years, and every night, on the bottom shelf of her cart, in a folder soft as cloth, she has carried the 11 measures. How do you carry the ending of the most famous song in the country in your coat pocket for 34 years? And never once let anyone hear you hum it. You do it the way Ruth did it. You do it by deciding, very early, that they took your name, but they will never, ever get your silence too. You do it by writing more music, in supply closets, on the backs of requisition forms, hundreds of pages, and a whole body of work no one will ever ask to see. Symphonies she scored in her head while she waxed the 3rd-floor corridor. A song cycle she wrote for her mother, 1 line at a time, on the inside of an empty paper towel box, over the course of a single winter. A concerto for her son that she has never played for a living soul. Because some things you keep for yourself, when the world has made it very clear that it does not intend to keep them for you. You do it by teaching your granddaughter scales on a keyboard from a pawn shop and pretending you learned them off the radio. You do it by keeping your head down and your hands moving and your grief in a key so private that no maestro in the world could ever find the door to it. You do it until a man with a baton throws a page of your own music at your feet in front of 40,000 people and dares you to finish it. Now meet Julian Whitcomb as the world met him, 68 years old, composé en résidence, former dean, distinguished chair of composition, the living face of the Barrington, a man who has walked the 4th-floor corridor 8,000 mornings and never once seen the woman polishing the brass rail he trails his hand along. Not chosen to ignore her. That would require noticing her long enough to ignore. He simply walks through the space where she is standing, as though she is weather, as though she is furniture, as though she is the building itself, functional and mute. In 34 years, Julian Whitcomb has never asked Ruth Delacroix her name. He will tell you his whole life is the concerto. That part is honest. His whole life is the concerto. He has never written anything of consequence since 1986. 30 years of works in progress that never progress. Of commissions quietly returned. Of grand symphonies announced with fanfare and abandoned in silence. His 3 ex-wives could tell you what that does to a man. The terror of the second act that never comes. The drinking. The cruelty that leaks out of a person who suspects, in the marrow of his bones, that his greatest work was not his, and that he has spent his whole life guarding a grave, his protégé, a smooth assistant conductor named Preston Gale, has heard the faculty joke about it in the elevator. The man who wrote one masterpiece and spent 30 years proving he could not write 2. Preston never laughs at the joke, because Preston's entire career is downstream of Whitcomb's favor. And Preston has learned that the safest place to stand near a powerful man is directly behind him. Everything Whitcomb is rests on the coda that is not there. If someone ever finished it, I finished it correctly, with the 11 measures that fit like a key sliding into a lock. Then the silence would no longer be genius. It would be a hole, and everyone would want to know how the hole got there. And the answer would walk them straight back to a supply closet on the 4th floor, which is why, tonight, the 30th anniversary gala matters so much. Tonight, Whitcomb is unveiling his definitive restored edition. Tonight, the finest young pianist in the world will perform Ascension one last canonical time. Tonight, the mystery of the unfinished coda will be enshrined forever as the crown of American music. A famous critic named Vivian Alcott is here to write the review that fixes it in the canon for another 50 years. The most respected musicologist in the country, Dr. Margaret Ellsworth, is here to chair the scholarly panel that blesses it. And the live stream is here to carry all of it out to the world. Tonight was supposed to seal the grave. Ruth Delacroix finishes her day shift at 3 o'clock. She goes home. She cooks. She comes back at 7 in her gray coat. Because the night crew is short, and someone has to keep Carrington Hall clean during the gala. And for 34 years, that someone has been her. At 8:40 she pushes her cart to the back of the hall. The screen at the front is already lit, 12 feet tall. The final page of Ascension. The famous last bar trailing off into empty staves. Ruth stops her cart. She looks up at the silence. They gave a white man a prize for, and something in her face. And you would have to be watching very closely. And no one ever watches her closely. Something in her face closes like a fist. And then, slowly, it opens, like a hand about to play. The gala opens the way these things open. A university president says the word legacy 4 times. A donor is thanked. The lights come down. Julian Whitcomb walks out to a standing ovation. And he takes it the way he takes everything. As his due, arms slightly open, chin lifted. A man accepting the weather. He speaks for 20 minutes. He is, it must be said, a superb performer of himself. He talks about 1986. He talks about the months of solitude in which the concerto arrived. He uses that word, arrived, the passive voice of the thief, as though the music simply appeared on his desk one morning fully formed, and he was merely the fortunate room it chose to appear in. He talks about the coda. He gets quiet. He lets the whole hall get quiet with him. There is a question at the end of Ascension. He says that I have been asked for 30 years to answer. What does the silence mean? Why does it not resolve? He gives the mysterious smile that has sold 100,000 recordings. And for 30 years I have given the only honest reply. Some music is brave enough to leave the door open, to refuse the cheap comfort of resolution. The coda of ascension cannot be finished. And here his eyes, for the first time all night, drift up and back, toward the aisle at the rear of the hall, where a woman in a gray coat is standing very still beside a bucket, because it was never meant to be finished, by any hand, least of all, he says, and he lets the contempt bloom slowly, so the cameras can catch every second of it, by someone who thinks a symphony is something you turn down. And you already saw what happened next. You saw him tear the page loose and hurl it at her feet. You heard the laugh. You heard him call her trash and tell her to go back to her bucket, in front of 200 people and 40,000 more watching from home. Here is what he did not expect. 3 people in that hall did not laugh. In the second row, Vivian Alcott, the critic who had flown in from New York to canonize him, set down her pen. In the wings, a 27-year-old archivist named Nathaniel Cho closed his eyes, because Nathaniel Cho knew something, and had known it for 4 months, and had said nothing. And on the aisle, 70 years old, silver-haired, straight-backed, Dr. Margaret Ellsworth, the most respected musicologist in the country, narrowed her eyes at Julian Whitcomb, and did not make a sound, and the woman in the gray coat began to walk. What does it sound like? The exact moment a woman who has been silent for 34 years decides that the silence was never hers to keep. It sounds like soft-soled shoes on marble. It sounds like the small squeak of a mop bucket wheel that she does not stop to still, because she is done, tonight, apologizing for the sound she makes when she moves through this building. She does not run. She has never once run for these people, and she is not going to start now. She walks down the long side aisle, unhurried, and the camera operator on the live stream, en pur instant, because something is happening, and cameras can smell it, swings to follow her, and 40,000 people at kitchen tables in Cleveland and Atlanta and Oakland and Houston lean toward their screens. And the comment counter jumps, and someone types, "Who is she?" And someone types, "Why is she going up there?" And someone types nothing at all, and just watches, because they have seen this walk before, in themselves, in their mothers, and they know it in their bones. Ruth reaches the aisle beside the panel table, where Dr. Margaret Ellsworth is sitting. She stops. She does not ask for a microphone. She does not ask for the floor. She leans down, close, and she speaks to Ellsworth alone, so quietly that only the scholar and the clip-on microphone the broadcast crew left on the table. "We can hear it, Dr. Ellsworth," Ruth says. "In about 4 minutes, he is going to want someone he respects to stand up and call me a liar. When he does, I would ask you to listen with your ears, instead of your assumptions." Margaret Ellsworth turns her head slowly, and she looks up at the woman in the gray coat. And it is the first time all night, perhaps the first time in a very long time, that anyone in Carrington Hall has actually looked at Ruth Delacroix. Their eyes hold for 3 full seconds, and something crosses between them that no one else in that room can see. One old woman, recognizing something in another old woman, some private, buried, decades-deep grief that scholars and janitors turn out to share far more often than either of them would ever guess. Then Ellsworth, who has spent 50 years learning the difference between the sound of a fraud and the sound of the truth, nods once. "By all means," she says. "Missus, I'm sorry. What is your name?" "Delacroix," Ruth says. Ruth Delacroix. It is the first time her name has ever been spoken aloud in Carrington Hall. Phones come up all across the audience. In the wings, Nathaniel Cho opens his eyes and grips the edge of a scenery flat because he knows that name. He has seen that name 4 months ago in a sub-basement, scraped off a title page under a razor blade, and the floor tilts underneath him. Ruth Delacroix straightens up. She walks to the lip of the stage. She bends down, and she picks up the page. Julian Whitcomb threw at her feet. She does not look at Whitcomb. She looks at the page. Then she walks up the 4 steps onto the stage. She crosses to the great black concert grand at the center of it. She pulls out the bench, and she sits down. Julian Whitcomb laughs out loud. "Oh, this is marvelous," he says. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, no, do not stop her. This is the most entertaining thing to happen at this school in a decade." He turns to the celebrated young virtuoso he flew in and waves him graciously aside. "Yield the instrument. By all means. Let the rest. I'm sorry. What was it?" "Liet Missa. Delacroix, show us how it's done." He says her name, the way you would hold something dirty out at arm's length. He steps back to the panel table, folds his arms, and settles in to enjoy it. "Whenever you're ready," he says. "We are all dying to hear the janitor play my concerto." Ruth sets the torn page on the music rack. She does not need it. She sets it there anyway, because there is a message in setting it there that Whitcomb is not yet clever enough to read. She flexes her cracked hands once. She places them on the keys, and then Ruth Delacroix begins to play Ascension from memory. Not the coda, not yet. She begins at the beginning. The first movement, the one the whole world knows, the one that opens every recording, that music students dissect, that made Julian Whitcomb a household name, and the hall goes silent, in a completely different way than it was silent a moment ago, because it is perfect. She does not fumble. She does not hesitate. Her hands are dry and split and 61 years old, and they move across that keyboard like water, finding the shape of a riverbed it carved a very long time ago. The famous opening, the one Whitcomb calls restlessness, unfolds under her fingers. And it is not restless at all. It is a neighborhood waking up. It is children in a street. It is a Saturday morning in a place that no longer exists. She plays the joy back into it. She plays the black back into it. And every serious musician in that hall, the orchestra players sitting stunned in their chairs, the faculty, the young virtuoso frozen at the edge of the stage, every one of them hears, in the first 30 seconds, something they cannot explain, that this is not a performance of the piece. This is the piece, being played by the person it belongs to. In the third row, an elderly emeritus professor, retired, 15 years, dragged to the gala by his wife, leans slowly forward. Vivian Alcott lifts her phone, very carefully, and she begins to record. The live stream comment counter reads 58,000, and it is doubling. Julian Whitcomb's smile does not move, but something behind his eyes flickers. Vance, like a fuse tripping in a house at night, because he knows this piece better than anyone alive, and he can hear, he of all people can hear, that she is not reading it. She is remembering it. And there is a difference. And it is the difference between a tourist reciting directions and a woman walking home. He steps forward. A very impressive party trick. He says loudly, over the music, trying to break the spell. You have clearly listened to the recording a great many times, while dusting. But the coda, Miss Delacroix, the coda, The whole point of my remarks was the ending. Anyone can play what is already written. I asked for the one thing that cannot be. Ruth does not stop playing. She has reached the third movement now. The machines. The bulldozers. And she plays it the way she wrote it in 1986. At 18 years old. With all of the terror and all of the fury he sanded away. And two of the orchestra's percussionists, sitting right behind her, put their hands over their mouths, because they can suddenly hear what the piece was always supposed to be. And it is unbearable. And it is magnificent. And then the third movement ends. And the whole hall knows what comes next. The famous open chord. The unresolved question. The silence. Ruth plays the open chord. She lets it hang. The hall holds its breath. 40,000 people hold their breath. This is where the record ends. This is where the concert ends. This is where, for 30 years, the silence has been allowed to do its immortal work. And then Ruth Delacroix does the thing that no hand alive was ever supposed to be able to do. She keeps playing. What happens to a man who built his entire life on a door being locked? The instant a woman takes a key out of her coat pocket and opens it, the first note past the open chord lands, and something in the room breaks, because it fits. It fits the way a bone fits back into its socket. The whole hall, even the people with no training at all, even the 40,000 at their kitchen tables, feels it happen, feels the thing that has hung, unresolved for 30 years, begin, at last, to resolve. And it does not resolve cheaply. It does not resolve the way you expected. It resolves better than you expected. It turns, and it deepens, and it takes the grief that was frozen in that open chord, and it lays it down, gently, the way you lay down something heavy that you have carried too far. 11 measures, the silence with everything in it. And here's the thing about those 11 measures. The thing that no critic in 30 years was ever able to explain. Because none of them had ever been allowed to hear it. They do not sound like a solution to a puzzle. They do not sound clever. They sound like grief that has finally been permitted to sit down. They sound like the moment, at the end of a long funeral, when the last person leaves the graveside, and the wind moves through the place, and the place is not empty, because you were there, and you remember. And remembering is the last thing the machines can never bulldoze. 61 years old, in a coat, a size too big, with ammonia-split hands, Ruth Delacroix plays her mother back into a world that erased her. And the world, this time, does not get a vote, the sound a place makes when it is gone, but not forgotten. The Emerald, Paradise, Row, Odessa Delacroix, at a piano that is buried now, under an expressway, and underneath all of it, threaded so quietly, you might miss it. A melody the room does not recognize, because it was never on any recording. A fragment of an old hymn, braided with an old blues. The exact thing Odessa used to do at the Emerald. The seam you cannot find. Passed from a dead mother into her living daughter's hands. Nathaniel Cho, the young archivist, has come out of the wings without deciding to. He is standing at the very edge of the stage now. In full view, tears running openly down his face. One hand pressed flat over his own mouth, because he has read the 11 measures 4 months ago, in the sub-basement, una page, in a woman's handwriting, in a box marked with a single word, discard. And he said nothing. And here they are, alive, in the air. Dr. Margaret Ellsworth has risen slowly to her feet at the panel table. Her lips are moving. She is a scholar. She cannot help it. She is doing the analysis in real time. Even as her eyes fill, And what the analysis is telling her, measure by measure, is a thing she will say out loud in 90 seconds. And it will end a man's career. This coda is not new. This coda is older than the piece. This coda was written first, and everything else was built to lead here. Ruth plays the final measure. She lets the last chord bloom. Full, resolved, home, and she lifts her hands off the keys. The silence that follows is 4 full seconds long. Real silence. This time, not the trademarked silence of a stolen concerto. The silence of 200 people and 40,000 more, understanding all at once, together, what they have just been allowed to witness. Then one orchestra player, the principal cellist, an older black man named Curtis Boyd, who has played in the Barrington's Pit for 20 years and has been called maestro by exactly no one. Curtis Boyd sets down his bow, and he stands up, and he begins to clap, alone, loud, and then Nathaniel Cho is clapping, and then a percussionist, and then the whole cello section stands, and then the violins, and then the young virtuoso Whitcomb flew in, the one whose instrument Ruth just borrowed, puts his hands together and stands, and the front rows, the laughing front rows, are on their feet, whether they understand it or not, because the whole hall is rising like a tide. And the sound of it is so loud that the microphone on the live stream actually distorts, and the comment counter is a blur now, climbing past 100,000. And the words scrolling past are all the same. 3 words, in a dozen different forms. She wrote it. She wrote it. Oh my God. She wrote it. Julian Whitcomb has not moved. His baton is on the floor. He looks like a man watching his own house burn down from across the street, unable to remember which door he left the matches by. Ruth Delacroix stands up from the bench. She does not bow. She does not smile. She turns, and she looks at him. And for the first time all night, she lets him see her face fully. And it is not the face of a victim. And it is not the face of a woman who has just won a bet. It is the face of a woman who has just, in front of the whole world, laid a thing down that she carried for 34 years. But Julian Whitcomb did not survive 50 years in the concert world by having a conscience. He survived it by having reflexes. And a cornered man reaches for the oldest weapon there is. He reaches for the lie. He steps forward, fast, and he snatches the microphone off the stand. And his voice comes out too loud. And it cracks on the very first word. And he hates that it cracks. Stop. Stop. All of you. The applause falters. He turns to the panel table, to Ellsworth, to the cameras, and his face has rearranged itself into something wounded and grave. Ladies and gentlemen, I am truly sorry that you had to see this. This poor woman, he gestures at Ruth without looking at her, is not well. She has worked in this building for many years, and I am afraid that over those years, she has developed a fixation, a delusion. It is a documented phenomenon. She has clearly memorized my concerto, note for note, obsessively, over decades, and she has convinced herself. His voice drops, pitying, poisonneux, that she wrote it. I have been made aware of her situation before. I chose to be kind. I let her keep her job. He turns to the room, and now the wound becomes a blade. She is a fantasist. Assad. Unwell fantasist who mops these floors. And you are all, in your sentimentality, about to destroy the reputation of a serious artist over the fever dream of a cleaning woman. He lets that land. Look at her. Look at her. and then look at me and tell me, truly, which one of us wrote the greatest concerto of the age? The hall lurches. It is a good lie. It is a smart lie. And it is aimed exactly where lies like this are always aimed, at the gap between what people just heard and what people have always been told is possible. Two people near the front sit back down, uncertain, pressed on Gale. The protégé materializes at Whitcomb's shoulder and murmurs into the second microphone. The maestro is right. This is deeply inappropriate. Someone should escort her. Vivian Alcott has stopped recording. Her hand is over her mouth. Dr. Margaret Ellsworth stands very straight, and she says nothing yet, because Ruth Delacroix has raised one hand, palm out, toward the panel table. Not yet. And Ellsworth, who understands more than anyone in that room, sits back down. Ruth does not cry. She does not look surprised. She looks at Julian Whitcomb for a long, level second, and then she does the last thing he expects. She smiles. Small, tired, almost. And this is the thing that unnerves him most. I am most grateful because, in that moment, Ruth Delacroix understands two things at once. One, the man in front of her is not powerful. He is terrified. He has been terrified for 30 years. And two, she does not have to be careful with him anymore. She has been careful with powerful white men her entire life. And this one is not powerful. And she is 61 years old. And she is done. What does it cost a woman to keep her dignity in a room that is deciding, in real time, whether to believe her? And what does it cost the man who bet his whole life on her staying quiet? Ruth walks to the front of the stage. She does not take a microphone. She does not need one. The clip the broadcast crew left on Ellsworth's table is still live. And the room has gone so quiet you could hear a bow set down. He's right about one thing, Ruth says. And her voice is even. And it carries. I have memorized this concerto. Every note. I have had 34 years. She lets that sit. I have also memorized, she says, the second movement transition he never understood, the one he corrected in his definitive edition, the one that is wrong in his restored score, because he never knew why it modulated the way it modulated, because he was not there, in the room, in Paradise Row, when the notice went up on the door. I can play it wrong, the way he wrote it, or I can play it right, the way I wrote it. Would you like to hear both? Professor. Whitcomb's mouth opens. Nothing comes out. Ruth turns away from him. She turns to the cameras. She turns to the 40,000. 140,000 now. People watching from break rooms, and hospital waiting rooms, and cramped kitchens, all over the country. She turns, though she does not know it, to a 9-year-old girl named Nina, in a row house in West Philadelphia, who has just been handed a phone by her father, who has just seen his own mother's face on a live stream, and who is saying, over and over, in a voice going up at the end, that's your mother, Nina. That's your grandmother. Ruth turns to all of them, and she speaks plainly. My name is Ruth Delacroix. I was born in a neighborhood called Paradise Row, that the city tore down when I was 7 years old, so that an institution could build a parking garage on top of my mother's church. A pause. My mother was named Odessa. She cleaned houses in the day, and she played the piano at a hall called the Emerald at night. And she was the finest musician I have ever heard in my life. And there is not one recording of her anywhere on this earth, because in her time, A black woman who cleaned houses did not get recorded. She got erased. That is the word. Erased. The hall is utterly still. In 1982, I became the first black woman ever admitted to the composition program at this conservatory. In 1986, I wrote a concerto for my mother, and for my neighborhood, and for everything they bulldozed. I called it Requiem for Paradise Row, and I played it for my advisor. She turns her head, just slightly, toward Whitcomb. You know his name. A sound moves through the audience. It is not a gasp. It is deeper than a gasp. 6 weeks later, my scholarship was gone, and I was out of this school. And 8 months after that, my concerto was on the cover of a magazine, with his name on it, and my mother's name nowhere on it. And the ending, the 11 measures I never gave him, the ones I just played for you, was missing, and they gave him a prize for the missing part. Her voice does not rise, and that is the terrible power of it. It does not rise. For 30 years, the thing they have been calling his genius was just the shape of the hole, where my mother's grief used to be. Vivian Alcott is writing again. Fast, both hands, the pen tearing the paper. He asked you, Ruth says to the room, to look at me, and look at him, and decide who wrote the greatest concerto of the age. She spreads her cracked, ammonia-split hands, palms up. So look, I am asking you to look at the woman with the bucket. That is exactly who he was, counting on you not to believe. A beat. That is exactly who he stole it from. And then she says the thing that finishes it, the thing they will replay 10 million times, the thing that ends up on a mural in West Philadelphia within the year. I have swept the floor of this hall 4,000 times. Ruth Delacroix says, and not once, in 34 years, did I ever stop hearing the music. You can take a person's name off of a page. You cannot take the music out of the hands that made it. She looks at Whitcomb. One last time. You had 30 years to compose one more masterpiece. Professor, you couldn't. And you know why you cannot finish what you did not start. You never could hear the ending, because the ending was never yours. Silence. And then, from the panel table, Dr. Margaret Ellsworth stands. Margaret Ellsworth is 70 years old, and she is the most respected musicologist in the country. And she has spent 50 years in rooms exactly like this one. And she has spent 50 years being careful, and she is done being careful too. She walks to the front. She does not go to Whitcomb. She walks past him, as though he is weather. And he feels it, the small, perfect cruelty of being, for 1 second, treated exactly the way he treated Ruth for 34 years. And she comes to stand beside Ruth Delacroix at the lip of the stage. And she turns to the cameras. For the record, Ellsworth says, and her voice is a scholar's voice. Dry and exact and absolutely without doubt. I am Dr. Margaret Ellsworth. I have studied this concerto for most of my professional life. I have published on this coda, en its absence, 3 separate times. She pauses. I was wrong 3 times. The hall does not move. What I have just heard is not a completion of ascension. It is the source of it. The 11 measures Miss Delacroix just played are the harmonic key that the entire concerto is a modulation toward. In plain terms, the piece was written toward that ending. Everything before it exists to arrive there. You cannot fake that. You cannot memorize your way into it. The person who wrote the coda wrote the concerto. She turns, and she looks directly at Julian Whitcomb for the first time. And you, Julian, I could never write the coda. Because you did not write the concerto. I have wondered, for 30 years, why a man of your evident limitations produced one single work of genius, and then nothing, ever again, for the rest of his life. Her voice does not soften. And now I know. It only happens once. When you steal it. She turns back to the room. I will be referring this matter to the Board of Trustees tonight. I will be requesting a forensic examination of the original manuscript in the Rotunda case, the one under glass, the one with the name scraped off the corner, that I have personally walked past 100 times, and never once thought to question, because I was told whose it was, and I believed what I was told. A hard breath. I will be recommending that this concerto be recatalogued and published and performed from this day forward under the name of its composer, Ruth Delacroix. She pauses, and under its true title, Requiem for Paradise Row. And then Dr. Margaret Ellsworth does the thing that the whole room will remember longest. She turns to the orchestra, the frozen, weeping orchestra, and she lifts both of her hands, palms up, the universal gesture of a conductor asking her players to rise. Ms. Delacroix, she says quietly, so that only Ruth and the microphone can hear it. You have never once heard your own concerto played by an orchestra, have you? Ruth's composure cracks, just slightly, just at the corners. For the first time all night, no, she says. No, I never have. Then, sit down, Ellsworth says gently, and she gestures to the piano, and let them play it with you. All of it. Your movements. Your ending. She raises her voice to the players. From the top, we follow her. Curtis Boyd, the principal cellist, already standing, lifts his bow. The young virtuoso pulls a second chair up to the piano to turn the pages for a woman he has just decided is the greatest living composer he has ever met. The concertmaster raises her violin. 80 musicians who have played Ascension 100 times lift their instruments to play Requiem for Paradise Row for the very first time. Following the small, straight-backed woman in the coat, a size too big, who has just sat back down at the bench, Julian Whitcomb stands in the middle of his own life and watches it end. What does it sound like? An entire orchestra, choosing, all at once, in front of the whole world, to follow the woman they never once looked at. It sounds like the first movement of Requiem for Paradise Row, played correctly, by 80 people, for the first time in the world, at 9 o'clock at night, on a live stream, watched now by 200,000 human beings, who are all in living rooms across a country that has been erasing women like Ruth Delacroix for 400 years, feeling the exact same thing. At the exact same time, they are feeling her be seen in a break room at a hospital in Cleveland. A nurse named Dolores has stopped charting. She is 52 years old, 3 separate times in her life. A man with more letters after his name than her has explained to her, slowly, a thing she already understood better than he did. And 3 times she has said nothing, because the cost of saying something was a cost she could not afford. She is not crying. She is standing very still, with her phone in her hand, watching an old woman in a gray coat play an orchestra like she built it. And she is feeling something come loose in her chest that has been welded shut for 30 years. In a barber shop in Houston, a man cuts the volume on the game and turns up the live stream on his laptop, and the whole shop goes quiet. 6 men and 2 kids, and one of the old men in the waiting chairs, a man who remembers what a place like Paradise Row was. because his own was torn down too, in a city 1,000 miles away, for reasons that always somehow ended with a highway. Takes off his hat and holds it in his lap. In Oakland, a girl who was told by her guidance counselor that composition programs are not really realistic for someone with your background, is sitting on the edge of her bed, with tears running into her collar. And she is opening a notebook that she closed 2 years ago in a middle school in Detroit. A music teacher named Renard, who has been running a broken-down band program out of a converted supply room on a budget that shrinks every single year, has pulled his phone out in the middle of his lunch break, and he is holding it up. So the 3 students who eat in his room because they have nowhere else to go can see the screen. And he does not say anything. He just points at the woman in the gray coat, and then he points at the 3 of them, one at a time. And the message needs no words. That is you. That could be you. Do not let anybody tell you it is not you. In Atlanta, in a small apartment, an 88-year-old woman who once, half a century ago, played piano at a hall that no longer exists, in a neighborhood that no longer exists, whispers to a television, "They can hear you now. Baby, they can finally hear you." And she does not know Ruth Delacroix from Adam. And it does not matter, because she is talking to herself, and to Odessa, and to every one of them the machines drove under, hundreds of thousands of people, in living rooms, and break rooms, and hospital waiting rooms, all over the country, are watching the same moment, on the same screen, and feeling the exact same thing. What is it worth? The precise second a woman who was never supposed to be visible sits down and plays her whole life out loud, and a country that spent 400 years looking away is finally, all at once, forced to look. In West Philadelphia, Isaiah Delacroix is on the floor of his living room, his daughter's phone in his hand, and he is crying the way grown men cry when they finally learn the size of what their mother carried. And Nina is standing over him, 9 years old, watching her grandmother's hands on the screen. And she says, the thing children say when a door they did not know existed swings open in front of them. "Daddy?" Nina says, "Can I do that?" And Isaiah, wiping his face, laughing, wrecked, says, "Baby, you already can. It's in your hands." She put it there. The concerto ends. The real one. All of it. The neighborhood. The notice. The machines. And the 11 measures. The silence, with everything in it. Resolved at last. Home at last. In front of everyone, the ovation lasts 11 minutes. Someone times it. It makes the news. Ruth Delacroix walks off the stage. She does not stop. She does not turn. She walks past the panel table, past the rotunda case with the manuscript that has her scraped-off name in the corner, past the marble she has cleaned 4,000 times, and she keeps walking, out of Carrington Hall, into the corridor, into the rest of her life. What happened after happened fast. Dr. Margaret Ellsworth was as good as her word. She went to the board that same night. The forensic examination of the manuscript took 9 days, under ultraviolet light, beneath the confident inked title, Ascension, by Julian Whitcomb. The analysts found the original, scraped away with a razor but ineradicable to the machines. Requiem for Paradise Row. Ruth Delacroix, 1986. Whitcomb's handwriting appeared nowhere in the underlying draft. Hers appeared everywhere. Nathaniel Cho came forward before he was even asked. He walked into the provost's office the very next morning with the box from the sub-basement, the one marked with a single word, discard. And inside it were 40 pages in Ruth's own hand, including a clean copy of the 11 measures, dated in her own writing to the spring of 1986. He had found them 4 months earlier. While cataloging old faculty files, he had recognized exactly what they were, and he had been a 27-year-old with no tenure, and no power, and a rent he could not afford to miss. And he had been afraid, and he had said nothing, and he told the provost all of it, plainly, and then he resigned, because he said a man who sits on the truth to protect his paycheck should not be the one guarding a school's history. The board did not accept his resignation. Ruth asked them not to. He was afraid. She said, when they asked her, "I know exactly what this building does to people who are afraid of it." He came forward. That counts. Fear that ends in the truth is worth more than courage. That was never tested. And so Nathaniel Cho became, within the year, the lead archivist of a project that would make his name. But that comes later. Julian Whitcomb did not fare so gently. Within 72 hours, the story was on the front page of every major paper in the country. Vivian Alcott's piece ran first, and it ran long, and its headline was the one that stuck. The silence was a theft. How a janitor's stolen concerto became a white man's legend. Within a week, his publisher had pulled the definitive restored edition from print. Within 2 weeks, his honorary degrees began. Alnebe won. To be rescinded. The prize he had won for the courageous, unresolved coda was formally revoked by a committee that issued a single line: "One cannot be honored for the courage of a silence one merely failed to fill." His name came off the chair. His name came off the concert hall wing that bore it. His name, in the end, came off very nearly everything, which is a particular kind of justice for a man whose entire crime was taking a name off of a page. Preston Gale, the protégé. We gave an interview 3 days in, claiming he had always had questions, and then a graduate student produced an email in which Preston, on the very morning of the gala, had written to a colleague, "The cleaning woman's situation is handled. Ignore her. Focus on the live stream." Preston Gale is not in music anymore. Whitcomb himself never appeared in person again. He signed, eventually, a statement posted on the Barrington's homepage, acknowledging the authorship of Ruth Delacroix, the alteration of the original, and the lawyers made him write this part. Conduct inconsistent with the values of the institution. He signed it. He did not read it aloud. He did not come to the hall. He wrote exactly one private letter to Dr. Margaret Ellsworth, which Ellsworth has never made public, and which contained, she has said, a single sentence: "I was wrong about the concerto, and I was wrong about her. And I have only ever been capable of apologizing for one of those things." Ruth Delacroix never read the letter. Ellsworth offered it to her. Ruth tucked it, unopened, into the back of a folder, and never spoke of it again, because she had spent 34 years being the keeper of other people's silences, and she was finished holding his too. But the Barrington did not stop at punishing one man. And this is the part that mattered. This is the part Ruth insisted on, because if the story ended with Julian Whitcomb disgraced and Ruth Delacroix credited, then all it would ever prove is that one theft got caught. And Ruth knew, Ruth of all people knew, that hers was not the only name ever scraped off a page in the history of American music. How many other manuscripts are sitting in how many other basements? In how many other boxes marked discard? In the storerooms of how many other institutions? built on top of how many other Paradise Rows. The Barrington launched a full forensic audit of every attribution in its archive, going back to its founding. And they found, and this made the news too, a year on, 3 other works by 2 other black composers and 1 other woman that had been quietly absorbed, uncredited, into the catalogs of celebrated faculty across the 20th century. Names went back onto pages. Grandchildren got phone calls. A 91-year-old woman in Baltimore learned that a string quartet she had been told her late husband helped with had Balfin, in fact, been written by him entirely and stolen entirely. And she wept on the phone to an archivist named Nathaniel Cho, who by then had made restoring exactly these things his life's work. 6 months later, on a bright, cold morning, an orchestra that Ruth Delacroix had only ever read about walked onto a stage in New York and performed the world premiere of Requiem for Paradise Row by Ruth Delacroix. Correct title, correct name, all 4 section, and the 11 measures, resolved at the end. For all the world to hear, Ruth conducted it. She had never conducted an orchestra in her life. She learned, it turns out that when a woman has heard a piece complete in her own head for 34 years, she does not have much trouble showing 80 people where it needs to go. She stood on the podium, in a plain dark dress, gray hair pinned back the way she has always pinned it. And she brought her mother's music into the world with her own 2 ammonia-split hands. And when the coda resolved, she did not turn around to take the applause. She stood facing the orchestra, her back to 2,000 people on their feet, and she closed her eyes, because the one person she had written it for could not be in the room, and she wanted, for 1 second, to be alone with her when it was over, and the 2,000 people stood and would not sit back down. Ruth finally turned around, and she found the faces in the front row before she found any of the critics, or the cameras, or the men in good suits who had all suddenly remembered her name. She found her granddaughter first. Nina was standing up on the seat itself, too small to be seen over the row, otherwise clapping with her whole body the way children clap. And Ruth held that child's eyes across the entire distance of the hall. And something passed between the 61-year-old woman and the 9-year-old girl that was older than both of them. The handing down of a thing that no institution had ever managed to break, passed from Odessa to Ruth, to Nina, mother, to daughter, to granddaughter, through supply closets, and scraped off names, and expressways poured over churches, unbroken, alive, still moving. In the front row sat Nina, in a dress her father had ironed twice. Beside her sat Isaiah, and beside him sat an empty seat, with a program laid across it, and a single white flower, for Odessa Delacroix, who cleaned houses in the day and played the emerald at night, and was never recorded, and whose music the world had said was gone, and who was, that night, in the only way that ever really lasts. In the room, Ruth did not go back to cleaning the Barrington, but she did not leave it either, not entirely, because the school, in the wreckage of its reckoning, did a thing that surprised everyone, including Ruth. It offered her the chair, distinguished chair of composition, the very one they had stripped from Julian Whitcomb. And Ruth Delacroix, 61 years old, looked at that offer for a very long time, and then she said no. She had a counter-offer. She would come, but not as the woman who took a disgraced man's title. She would come to build something And so the Barrington Conservatory of Music, the very institution that erased her in 1986, funded, at her direction, a thing that now bears a name you may have heard. They call it the Paradise Row Project. It does two things. First, it finds them, the lost ones. It sends archivists into the basements of institutions all across the country, into the boxes marked discard, into the storerooms, and the estate sales, and the church closets, hunting the manuscripts of black composers and women composers, whose names were scraped off pages, or never written on them at all. And it restores those names, and it gets that music played. Nathaniel Cho runs the search. In its first 3 years, the Paradise Row Project restored the authorship of 19 works, put 4 buried composers into the standard repertoire, and located, in a water-damaged trunk in a South Carolina attic, a set of songs that one musicologist described, with tears in her voice on national radio, as belonging in the American canon. There was a man named Elias Freeman, born in 1911, who wrote a symphony in 1949 that a celebrated conductor premiered in 1951, with the composer's credit conveniently absent from the program, and who died in 1968 in a rooming house, believing his life's work had vanished. The Paradise Row Project found the full orchestral parts in a trunk that his great-niece had been using as a footstool for 40 years. Not knowing what was inside it. When the project performed the symphony under Freeman's name, correct at last, his great-niece sat in the front row, 81 years old. And afterward, she said one thing to the reporters, and it was the thing Ruth had heard, in one form or another, from every single family the project ever reached. We always knew he was somebody. We just never had the paper to prove it. Now the whole world has the paper. That is what the project gives them. The paper, the name on the paper, the proof that was owed and withheld. And second, and this is the part Ruth cares about most, it teaches the children. There is a small rehearsal room at the Paradise Row Project, and on a Tuesday afternoon, it is full of children, 8 of them, ages 7 to 12, most of them holding an instrument for the first time in their lives, all of them a little frightened, because they have been told, in 100 small ways, most of their lives, that rooms like this one are not for people like them. Ruth Delacroix stands at the front, gray hair pinned back, the same plain clothes she has always worn. She never did change her clothes to deserve to be there. She was always allowed to be there. She just had to walk through the door. Her granddaughter Nina is in the second row, 10 years old now, already better than she has any right to be. Ruth lifts a marker to the whiteboard. She writes one word, "Hello." Then she turns to the children, and she smiles, really smiles, the whole face of it. The kind of smile that 34 years of gray coats and scraped-off names never once managed to take from her. Before we play a single note, Ruth says, we are going to go around the room, and every one of you is going to tell me your name, and I am going to remember every single one, because in this room, your name goes on the music. Always. First, she looks at the smallest child in the back. A boy nobody has looked at all afternoon. A boy trying to make himself small against the wall. A boy who looks startled to be seen. And she does not point at the most talented one. She does not point at Nina. She points at him. You first, Ruth says gently. What's your name? The boy opens his mouth. And that, the sound of a child, in a room built for him, about to say his own name out loud. On purpose. For the very first time. That is where we leave them. Hey, it's me. Before you close this, Can I sit with you for just 1 minute? Because the part of Ruth's story that gets me isn't the concerto. It isn't even the moment she sat down at that piano and played, the ending he swore no living hand could play. It's the badge, because there is one thing Ruth kept. On the wall of her small office at the project, in 2 cheap frames, she bought herself. The first is the original title page, Requiem for Paradise Row, her name back where she wrote it. The razor scrape left visible, unrepaired, on purpose, because she wanted the wound to show. And the second is her old custodial name badge, the one she wore for 34 years, and where the name should be. It reads one word, Maintenance, not Ruth, not Delacroix, not a human being with a mother and a son and a masterpiece in her coat pocket. Just Maintenance, 34 years. 34 years of walking past a glass case twice a week, buffing the fingerprints off the lid of the thing she made, watching a man take bow after bow for her grief, with her mother's name scraped off the corner. And here is the thing that keeps me up at night. Ruth Delacroix is not rare. That is the part nobody wants to say out loud. There is a Ruth in a basement somewhere right now. There is a box marked discard in a storeroom, in a building, in your city, with somebody's whole life inside of it. There is a woman cleaning a floor, in a place that has never once asked her name, carrying an ending in her coat pocket that the world has decided cannot be finished, because the world never once considered that she might be the one who could finish it. That is not the loud kind of injustice. That is the quiet kind, the kind that does not throw a punch, the kind that just looks away. For 34 years, so I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually answer it, not scroll past. Answer. What is the ending they told you could not be finished? The thing you know how to do, that a room full of people with more credentials than you swore was impossible. The name that got scraped off the top of your own work. The music in your own hands that you stopped playing out loud. Because somewhere along the way, you started to believe the badge instead of the truth. Ruth waited 34 years for one person. One, to be arrogant enough to hand her the marker. Don't wait that long, because here is what Ruth's whole life is trying to tell you, the things she would say if she were sitting here instead of me. The room does not have to earn it. You do, and you already can. It's in your hands. Somebody put it there. If this moved you, do 3 things for me. Leave 1 word in the comments. 1 word. Whatever this stirred up in you. I read every single one. I mean that. Share this with someone who is still waiting to be seen. Someone with a box marked discard in their own chest. They need to hear their name today. And subscribe. Because next week, I am telling you the story of the woman who walked back into Julian Whitcomb's old office, sat down at his desk, changed the nameplate on the door, and hung a badge that says maintenance on the wall behind her. So she would never, ever forget how they tried to bury her. You already know her name. Say it with me. Ruth Delacroix. I will see you Friday.